The day Beatrice Keller rode into the Hargrove Ranch yard with nothing but a bedroll, a weathered saddle bag, and a rifle slung across her back, every man on the crew stopped what he was doing and stared like she had ridden straight out of the sun itself. It was the spring of 1878, and the grasslands of southern Texas were just beginning to shake off the cold breath of winter. The mesquite was greening up along the creek bottoms. The bluebonnets were pushing through the cracked earth in patches of violet and blue, and the Kishom Trail was calling to drovers the way it always did when the season turned loud and relentless, like a wind that never quite stopped. Rancher Harold Hargrove had assembled 17 men to push 800 head of longhorn cattle from his spread outside of San Antonio all the way up to Abilene, Kansas. A journey of nearly 500 miles that would take the better part of 2 months on foot and hoof. Hargrove himself was standing on the porch of his ranch house when Beatrice rode in, and he came down the steps slowly, the way a man does when he is trying to decide whether a situation is a problem or a blessing, and has not yet figured out which. Beatrice pulled her roan mare to a stop in front of him. She was 26 years old, lean and sun-browned, with dark hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat and gray eyes that held the kind of steadiness a person only develops when they have survived things that would break most people. She wore men's trail clothes, sturdy canvas trousers, a cotton shirt, boots that had seen hard country, and she sat her horse the way someone does who was raised on horseback before they ever learned to walk far on 2 legs. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, without preamble, "I heard you are 2 hands short and heading to Abilene. I can ride, I can rope, I can cook if you need it, and I know every mile of the trail between here and the Red River crossing. I want a fair wage and a fair share of the work." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. He was not an unkind man, but he was a practical one, and the expression on his face moved through surprise, skepticism, and calculation before it landed somewhere quieter. "You Emmett Keller's girl," he said at last. "His daughter," she said. "Yes." Something shifted in the rancher's face. Emmett Keller had been one of the best trail hands in the region before a horse threw him, badly 2 winters ago, and left him with a leg that would never be right again. His reputation was sound as bedrock, and if his daughter had come up beside him learning the work, that counted for something in Harold Hargrove's accounting. "The men won't like it," Hargrove said, though his voice did not carry the weight of a refusal. "The men don't have to like it," Beatrice said. "They just have to work alongside me. I won't give them reason to complain about my work." Hargrove looked at her another long moment, then nodded once, slow and deliberate. $30 for the drive," he said, "same as any other hand." "That will do fine," Beatrice said, and she swung down from the saddle and began leading her horse toward the remuda line like she had been expected all along. That was when Jeremiah Bishop saw her for the first time. He was coming around the side of the barn with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a can of axle grease in his other hand, heading for the wagon that needed its wheels checked before the drive. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered and quiet in the way that the genuinely capable tend to be quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned long ago that talking did not get the work done. He had been riding trail since he was 16 and had made the run to Abilene 3 times before this one. Hargrove trusted him as his lead drover, which was about the highest compliment a trail boss could give. Jeremiah stopped walking when he saw her, not because of any surprise about her presence, but because something about the way she moved caught his attention in a way he could not immediately name. She was efficient. She was calm. She tied off her horse with the practiced hands of someone who has done it 10,000 times in the dark, and in the rain and without thinking. And then she turned and began checking the cinch on her saddle with the same focused attention a surgeon might give to something important. He watched her for a moment, then kept walking toward the wagon, because the wheels still needed grease and watching people was not part of the job. Chip Dawson, who was 22 and had a loud opinion about most things, appeared at Jeremiah's elbow. "She can't really mean to ride the whole drive," Chip said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Looks like she means to," Jeremiah said. "A woman on a cattle drive," Chip said, shaking his head. "That's bad luck." "Chip," Jeremiah said, setting down the grease can and looking at the younger man with a level expression, "I have heard the same thing said about red-headed men, left-handed men, men who whistle before breakfast, and men who read books. None of it ever turned out to be true. Get the wagon checked." Chip Dawson closed his mouth and got the wagon checked. The drive started at first light 2 days later. 800 Longhorns, 17 men, 1 woman, a cook wagon driven by an old Mexican man named Santos who had made the trip more times than he could count, and 4,000 miles of sky stretched above them like something that went on forever. The herd moved south of the city, then swung north, following the trail that was worn into the earth by the hooves and boots and wagon wheels of every drover who had come before them. The land was wide and flat at first, broken by live oak mottes, and the occasional dry creek bed that would be running with muddy water before long if the spring rains came as expected. Beatrice took her position on the left flank without being told to. She had read the shape of the herd, figured where the gaps were, and put herself where she was most needed. The flank rider's job was to keep the cattle from drifting sideways off the trail, to push strays back in, to ride back and forth in the heat and the dust and the monotony until the day was done. It was not glamorous. It was not special. It was just work, and she did it. Jeremiah rode point at the head of the herd, which meant he was the one who set the pace and directed the direction of travel. He could see her from a distance, off to the left, and through that first long morning he watched her the way a man watches something he is trying to figure out without being obvious about it. She handled strays cleanly. She used her horse well. She did not make the beginner mistake of chasing cattle hard and spooking them into a run. She moved at the edges of their vision, steady and patient, the way you have to when you are dealing with 800 animals that can all decide to go wrong at the same moment. By midday, when they stopped to water the herd at a shallow creek, Jeremiah came back along the flank on his way to speak with Santos about the noon meal. He rode past Beatrice, who was standing beside her horse drinking from her canteen. He pulled up beside her. It was the first time they had been close enough to actually speak. "You've done flank before," he said. It was not a question exactly. "Since I was 14, she said. "Good work this morning," he said. "You kept that near corner tight." "There was a big brindle steer wanted to walk into that brush line," she said. "He had his mind made up about it." "He's been doing that all week in the pen," Jeremiah said. "Keep an eye on him. He is the kind that tests you whenever he thinks you are not paying attention." "I have met his type," Beatrice said, and there was the faintest edge of dry humor in it that made Jeremiah nearly smile. He did not smile, but the line of his shoulders eased slightly. "Jeremiah Bishop," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it without hesitation. Her grip was firm and direct. "Beatrice Keller," she said. "I know," he said. "Hargrove told me." He rode on toward the wagon, and Beatrice watched him go for just a moment before she turned back to the herd, because the brindle steer was already eyeing the brush line again. The first week of a cattle drive is always the hardest in some ways and the easiest in others. The herd is fresh and restless, not yet settled into the rhythm of the trail, and the men are still working out their positions relative to each other. Who is fast? Who is reliable? Who will hold when things go sideways, and who will fold? By the end of that first week, the hierarchy is usually clear enough that the remaining miles of the drive can be organized around it. By the end of the first week on this particular drive, most of the men had quietly stopped noticing that Beatrice Keller was a woman, or rather, they noticed it but had separated it from any consideration of whether she was useful. She was clearly useful. The brindle steer had bolted 3 times, and she had turned him back all 3 times before he could take 5 others with him. She had also splinted the leg of a calf that got stepped on in a creek crossing, not because it was her job to, but because it was right in front of her and she had the skill to do it. Santos had, in the way of men who are old and have seen everything, taken an immediate liking to her, and had begun setting aside the best biscuits from the morning batch specifically for her plate, a distinction that he had never granted to anyone else in 14 years of cooking for Hargrove's drives. Chip Dawson was the last one still making noise about it. He had not said anything directly to Beatrice, but at the evening fire, he had a habit of talking in a way that was aimed in her direction while being addressed to the fire itself. On the 6th night out, he was sitting across the flames from her talking about how the old-timers always said a drive needed to be organized a certain way, with certain kinds of people in certain kinds of roles, when Beatrice looked up from her coffee cup and said, very pleasantly, "Chip, when was the last time you turned that near Brindle?" Chip was quiet for a moment. 3 days ago, he said. "I have turned him 11 times in 6 days, she said. "If you would like to take a shift with him tomorrow, I would genuinely appreciate the rest. He is wearing on me." She said it so without heat, so directly and genuinely that Chip had nothing to push against. He just sat there for a second and then he said, "Sure, I can do that." And after that he stopped making noise. Jeremiah had watched the whole exchange from across the fire. He had been whittling on a piece of mesquite, the small knife moving steadily, and he had not said a word. But when Beatrice looked up after Chip went quiet, and her eyes crossed the fire and met his for a half-second, she saw something in his face that might have been quiet approval. She looked back at her coffee. She did not know entirely what to make of Jeremiah Bishop. He was not like the other men on the drive, not in his manner or in the way he moved through a day. He was precise without being rigid, and he was kind without being soft. When old Santos's wheel axle cracked on the 7th morning and the wagon tilted badly and threatened to tip, it was Jeremiah who organized the repair with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has solved this particular problem before and knows exactly what each step requires. He had the wagon leveled, the axle repaired with the spare iron they carried, and the drive moving again inside of 90 minutes. He also had a way of appearing beside her that was never intrusive but was consistent. The first time the herd had a rough crossing at a shallow river south of Austin, he had appeared at her left side as she was pushing cattle into the current, and they had worked the crossing together without a word being exchanged about the division of labor. They had just each taken a part of the problem and solved it simultaneously, and afterward she had looked at him with a raised eyebrow, and he had nodded once and gone back to point. That evening, she thought about it while she brushed down her mare by the last of the daylight. She had spent enough time around men to know the various ways they interacted with a woman in a traditionally male space. Some ignored her aggressively, which was its own kind of statement. Some were excessively helpful in a condescending way that suggested they did not believe she could manage without assistance. Some resented her openly. Some made comments. Jeremiah Bishop did none of those things. He just worked beside her, the same way he worked beside any capable man on the crew, and he never once, not in those first 7 days, not ever turned to look at her with any expression that suggested her presence required explanation. She found that she kept thinking about it. They were 10 days out when the first real trouble came, as trouble on a cattle drive always eventually does. The skies had been building to the southwest all afternoon, the kind of dark anvil-shaped clouds that every person who has spent time in the Texas spring learns to read the way other people read text on a page. By the time Santos had the evening fire going, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in what felt like 20 minutes, and the cattle were restless in that low, sidelong way they get when something large and bad is coming. Jeremiah rode up and down the herd perimeter, reading the animals, and then he came back to where Beatrice was on the south flank and said, "We are going to have weather tonight." "I can feel it," she said. "The herd is already nervous." "I am going to put extra men on overnight rotation," he said. "I want you on the north side closest to that creek. If they run, they will try to run south toward the flat ground, and we need to keep the creek bank clear of strays so they do not go in the water in the dark." "I will take it," she said. "It will be a long night," he said. "I have had long nights before," she said. He nodded, but he paused a moment before he turned his horse, and in that pause she saw something cross his face, not uncertainty, but something more like concern, the kind that is trying to decide how to express itself without overstepping. "There are biscuits and dried beef in the saddlebag Santos left by your gear," he said at last. "If it gets bad enough that you cannot get back to the wagon, you will have something." It was such a simple thing, such a practical and thoughtful thing. She found that it stayed with her all through that long night, even when the storm hit at full force around midnight, and the sky opened up with rain driven sideways by a wind that felt like it was trying to peel the skin off the earth, and the cattle began to mill and bawl in that low, dangerous way that means the difference between a manageable night and a stampede is about 3 minutes and one lightning strike. The lightning came. It split the sky to the south in a crack that was almost simultaneous with the thunder, and the herd broke. 800 longhorns in full run at midnight in a thunderstorm are one of the most terrifying and overwhelming forces that a person can be adjacent to. The ground shakes. The sound is a roar that fills everything. The cattle move as a single tremendous body, and anyone caught in front of that body is simply erased. Beatrice's mare wheeled and ran automatically, her horse instincts faster than any human decision, and for a few seconds Beatrice was simply riding in the dark and the rain and the noise, unable to see more than 10 feet in any direction. She found the edge of the herd by sound, by the feel of the air, by the way the ground vibrated differently where the cattle were running versus where she was. She swung the mare out to the right, putting herself parallel to the run, and began working toward the front of the stampede. She could hear shouting over the storm other drovers doing the same thing from other sides. She pushed the mare harder. The trick with a running herd is to get ahead of the lead animals and turn them, to curve the front of the stampede gradually into itself, until the cattle are running in a circle, which they will continue to do until they tire and the energy bleeds out of the panic. It is called milling the herd, and it requires getting your horse in front of several hundred charging longhorns, which is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. She found the front of the run by sound more than sight, and she began angling in, shouting and waving her hat, pushing the lead animals to the left. Another rider appeared from the right, doing the same thing from the opposite side. Even in the dark and the rain she recognized the shape of Jeremiah Bishop on his horse, something in the way he sat, something about the economy of his movement. They turned the herd together, working both sides of the front simultaneously, pressing the lead animals inward without triggering a second break. And slowly, over the course of about 20 minutes that felt like 3 hours, the stampede curled into itself, and the cattle began to slow and mill and eventually stop. When the herd was standing and the thunder was rolling away to the northeast and the rain had softened to a cold, steady drizzle, Beatrice and Jeremiah ended up beside each other in the dark, both of them soaked through and breathing hard. "Anybody hurt?" she called out. Jeremiah did a quick count, riding in a loop. He came back. "All accounted for," he said. "Brody got his horse spooked and went down, but he got clear. Nothing broken." She exhaled. Her hands, she realized, were shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the massive physical and neurological effort of what had just happened, the overloading intensity of it now releasing from her system. "Good riding tonight," Jeremiah said. "You turned the front from the right," she said. "I would not have held them long without you coming in from that side." "We did it together," he said. The rain continued its soft pattern on their hats and their shoulders and the backs of the settling cattle, and neither of them said anything for a while. They just sat their horses in the dark and let the adrenaline drain away and listened to the herd breathe. "Are you all right?" he said after a while. The question was direct and genuine, and it caught her slightly off guard. Not the words but the tone, the particular quality of concern in it that was about her specifically and not about the operational status of a crew member. "I am fine," she said. And then, because honesty seemed to fit the moment, she said, "My hands were shaking a little after." "Mine too," he said. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things he did not mean. "Every time," she said. "Every time," he said. "If they stop shaking after that is probably when you should worry." She thought about that. "Get some sleep if you can," he said. "I will take first watch. Santos will have coffee at 3. He rode away into the drizzle, and she stayed for a moment watching him go. And then she turned back to the herd and her position on the north flank, because the cattle still needed watching, and the night was not done. The days that followed the storm settled into a rhythm that has no real comparison to anything that does not involve traveling through open country under open sky. The herd stretched out along the trail each morning and walked until the afternoon when the heat climbed, and the cattle slowed of their own accord. And then they rested in the long golden hours before the evening routine of the camp took over. The land changed as they moved north. The flat mesquite country of South Texas gave way to the rolling hills of the central region, greener and more broken, crossed by rivers and creeks that were running full and cold with spring snowmelt from the Edwards Plateau. Beatrice and Jeremiah began talking more during those days naturally, without either of them deciding to. It happened the way things happen on a long drive when two people are thrown together by proximity and circumstance, and discover that the proximity is not unwelcome. It started with practical conversation. The trail, the herd, the weather, the water crossings ahead. She knew the country well from driving cattle with her father through her teenage years, and he had been on this trail before but appreciated her specific knowledge of certain crossings and camp spots. They compared notes. They made plans. They worked out a system for the evening watch rotation that was more efficient than what Hargrove had been using, and when they brought it to the trail boss, he looked it over and adopted it without making a point of where it had come from. But the conversations began spreading beyond the practical. They happened in the evenings when the work was done, and the fire was low, and Santos was washing the cookware with the focused satisfaction of a craftsman at the end of his day. They happened in the early mornings before the herd was moving, when the sky was a pale gray pink, and the cattle were standing in the cool, and the world felt temporarily quiet. She found out that he had grown up in Georgia, the son of a farmer who had lost everything in the war. This was only 13 years after Appomattox, and the wound of it was still very much present in the texture of daily life in the South, though he spoke of it without bitterness, only with a kind of careful observation, like something he had examined thoroughly enough to understand without being defined by it. He had come west at 17, following the cattle trade, and had gradually built a reputation that had eventually brought him to Harold Hargrove's operation as a lead drover. She told him about her father, how Emmett Keller had raised her alone after her mother died of fever when Beatrice was 8, how he had brought her along on trail work because there was nowhere else for her to be, and how that practical necessity had turned into a real education that she would not trade for any other. She told him about the accident 2 winters ago, the horse that had thrown her father on a rocky hillside, and the months of recovery that had left his leg unreliable, and how she had taken on more of the physical work of their small ranch to compensate, and how it had become clear to her that if she was going to keep them both financially viable, she would need to hire on with a trail operation, because the cash money was better than anything she could earn close to home. "Does he know you are on this drive?" Jeremiah asked one evening, his tone genuinely curious. "He knows," she said. "He worried about it, not because he doubts what I can do, but because he knows how men can be." "And how have they been?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "Better than I expected mostly," she said. "Chip Dawson took a while, but he came around. The others accepted it faster." "Good men generally come around when they see the work," Jeremiah said. "Have you never questioned it?" she asked. The question had been sitting in her for days, and she decided to just let it out. "You have never once looked at me like you were trying to figure out what I was doing here." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I saw how you read that herd the first morning," he said. "After that it was pretty clear what you were doing here." He paused. Why would I question something that was right in front of my face? She looked at him across the fire. Most men would have anyway, she said. Then those men are wasting time they could spend on the work, he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not elaborate. But it was so complete in its simplicity, so genuinely unbothered, that she felt something in her chest shift slightly, some low-held tension that she had been carrying since before the drive started, the constant readiness to justify and defend and prove herself, loosened just a little. The Red River crossing was everything it was always said to be. They reached the southern bank on the 20th day of the drive, and the river was running high with spring water brown and fast and wide, carrying debris from the rains upriver. The Texas to Indian Territory crossing on the Kishom Trail had swallowed cattle and men before and would again, and standing on the bank looking at the current, every person in the crew was quiet for a moment with their own private arithmetic of risk. Jeremiah rode the bank for an hour before he selected the crossing point, a wide, gravelly shallowing where the current was marginally less fierce and the bottom was relatively firm. He organized the crossing methodically. The most experienced riders would take the lead, establishing a channel, and the herd would be pushed into the water in steady groups rather than all at once, which would create a dangerous press. The first group went in and Beatrice was on the left edge, keeping the cattle angled correctly across the current so they did not get turned sideways and swept downstream. The water was cold enough to shock. She could feel it through her boots the moment her horse stepped into the shallows, and the current pushed against her mare's legs with a real and steady force. Midstream, a cluster of steers panicked and began swimming in circles, getting tangled with each other and threatening to pull three others under. She saw it before anyone else and pushed her mare straight into the cluster, shouting and crowding the panicking steers with her horse's body until they straightened and found the current again and swam for the far bank. Jeremiah saw it from downstream. He was already in position to catch anything that got swept past him, and when she came through with the last of the panicked cluster and her horse climbed the far bank dripping and blowing, he was right there. That was clean work, he said, and there was something in his voice beyond professional appreciation, something that had broken through the controlled surface of him. It turned out all right, she said, pushing wet hair back under her hat. You went straight into the middle of a pile of panicked longhorns in a river current, he said. Someone had to, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The river was still moving behind her, loud and brown and relentless, and the rest of the herd was still crossing in their steady groups, and the day was bright and real around them, and he looked at her with an expression that had given up any pretense of neutrality and had become something more open. Beatrice, he said. We should get back for the second group, she said. Yes, he said. We should. They went back, and the second group crossed, and the third, and by late afternoon all 800 head were across, and the wagon had been ferried over by the same method used for a generation, floating it with rope guidance, and the crew was setting up camp on the Oklahoma side of the Red River, and the relief in the camp was the particular warm kind that follows something difficult done successfully. At the fire that evening, Santos produced a jug of whiskey that he had been guarding in the wagon specifically for river crossings, and it went around the camp with a good deal of toasting and laughter. Even Jeremiah took a measured sip, and when the jug passed between him and Beatrice, she held his gaze for a moment as she drank. To the Red River, she said. To getting through it, he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it was the first time he had heard it fully like that, and he thought it was probably the finest thing he had heard in a long time. He found himself watching her laugh and thinking about it afterward, thinking about the shape of the day she had put in, the way she had handled herself in the water, the steady quality of her that never asked for recognition and never shrank from difficulty. He thought about the way she had looked that first morning in the ranch yard, riding in like she had already made up her mind and was just waiting for the world to catch up. He thought about the conversations in the firelight and the way she said things directly, without performance, with the particular confidence of someone who has had to rely on their own judgment long enough that it has become second nature. He realized, with the same quiet precision he applied to everything else, in considerable trouble. He was not a man given to self-deception, which meant that once he had recognized this particular truth about himself, he had to look at it squarely. He was falling in love with Beatrice Keller. He had been doing it gradually and without intention since about the third day of the drive, and it was now approximately as irreversible as the fact of the Red River behind them. What he did not know was what she felt in return. She was warm to him, genuinely warm, the kind that is not performed. She sought him out in the evening sometimes, or did not seem displeased when he found her. She laughed with him in that unguarded way. But she was also self-contained in a way that made reading her interior life a complicated task, and he was not a man who moved forward on guesses. The Indian Territory they were crossing, what would one day become Oklahoma, was a vast and complicated place in 1878. The land had been promised and then redefined, and then promised again in ways that served the interests of the United States government more than they served the people whose land it was. And traveling through it on a cattle drive meant passing through a geography that was heavily freighted with injustice, that was still very much ongoing. The 5 civilized tribes had their own governments and their own systems in the territory, and any drover who was not an outright fool knew to respect the boundaries and protocols involved. Jeremiah had been through the territory twice before and had a clear sense of how to conduct the drive through it, staying to the Kishom Trail proper, giving wide berth to settlements, not letting the cattle drift onto farmland without permission and compensation. He was careful and correct about it, and Beatrice noticed this about him. "You take care with the territory," she said one morning as they rode. "It is their land," he said simply. "We are passing through." "Not every drover thinks that way," she said. "Not every drover should be trusted with a herd," he said. She thought about her father, who had said almost exactly the same thing. She felt the particular warmth of having a belief confirmed by someone you are coming to respect. They made good time through the territory, despite the heavy spring rains that turned the trail into a boot-sucking mudscape on more than one occasion, and required Santos to put extra mules on the wagon to haul it through the bad stretches. The cattle settled into their trail rhythm, that characteristic mile-leading walk that, while slower than any other mode of travel, covers ground with quiet inevitability. Santos's cooking remained the single most reliable pleasure of any given day. The crew found their groove. About 2 weeks into the territory crossing, they had an encounter that broke the routine. A small group of Cherokee men rode out to the trail from the east one midday, 4 of them, well-mounted and watching the herd with the assessing eyes of people who know cattle, and know when something coming through their country is going to leave behind some evidence. One of their horses was limping badly, a front leg wrapped in cloth that had soaked through and needed attention. Jeremiah rode out to meet them without hesitation, and Beatrice came with him because she was on the near flank and it was natural. The exchange was measured and respectful. The Cherokee men wanted to know who was in charge and what compensation was being offered for the trail use and any grass the cattle had taken. Jeremiah spoke with the leader of the group, a man about his own age with a straightforward bearing and excellent English, and negotiated an agreement that was fair by any measure. When the man's eye kept going back to the limping horse, Jeremiah said, "We have a woman with us who has veterinary skill. If you would allow it, she might look at that leg." The man looked at Beatrice with some curiosity, and Beatrice, without waiting for a formal invitation, swung down from her mare and said, in an even, professional tone, "May I?" The man nodded, and she went to the horse and unwrapped the cloth and examined the leg with careful hands. It was a deep cut, probably from wire. The territory was beginning to see the first tentative barbed wire fences, and the damage they did to animals that found them the hard way was significant. The wound was not infected yet, but it was close. She cleaned it with water from her canteen, and with the carbolic solution she carried in her medicine bag, she had learned to always have it, and she repacked it with a clean dressing from the supply Santos kept in the wagon. She showed the man's companion what to look for in terms of infection and how to change the dressing. The Cherokee leader watched all of this and then looked at Jeremiah. "She is good," he said. "Yes," Jeremiah said, "she is." The two groups parted with mutual courtesy, and as Beatrice remounted and they rode back toward the herd, she said, without making a production of it, "Thank you for offering that." "I could see the horse needed attention," he said. "You also knew how to ask without making it strange," she said. He glanced at her. "Is that a compliment, Beatrice?" "It might be," she said. They were both quiet, but the quiet between them had a different texture, now warmer, closer, charged with a low current that neither of them had named yet, but that both of them were increasingly aware of. They crossed into Kansas 3 days after the territory line, and the character of the land changed again, flatter, the grass lower and blonde rather than the tall green of further south, the sky seeming to expand to an even greater size, which in Kansas is considerable. They were inside of 2 weeks from Abilene now, and the end of the drive was a real and concrete thing on the horizon. Jeremiah began to spend more of his evenings beside Beatrice at the fire, and she made no indication that this was unwelcome, and the two of them talked in the way that people talk when they have moved past the stage of learning about each other and into the stage of simply being together. They talked about small things and significant ones. He told her about the valley in Wyoming Territory he had seen on a supply trip north 3 years ago, a green and wide-open piece of country with water and grass and room that had never left his thinking. She told him about the piece of land adjoining her father's property that had come up for sale recently, and how she had been working out whether the money from this drive plus what she had saved could be enough to make an offer on it. "To run cattle," he said. "To run cattle," she said. "My father's leg is what it is. He can oversee and manage, but the physical work needs someone else to carry it. The land adjoining his is the only piece in the county that would make it viable. Without it, the operation is too small to sustain." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "What would you do," she asked, "after Abilene?" It was the first time she had asked him directly about his plans, and he took the question seriously. "I have been thinking about that," he said. "I have been thinking about it for the last 3 weeks more than I have in the previous 3 years combined." She looked at him. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am not in the habit of being subtle about things that matter," she said, "but I am also not certain of what I am reading." He turned his head and looked at her fully, and the firelight was moving across his face in a way that laid all of it bare, the seriousness and the warmth and the thing that had been building in him for weeks. "Then let me be plain," he said. "I have found that spending a day is better when you are in it. I have found that I look for you when you are not in sight. I have found that your judgment is better than most people's, and your company is better than anyone's I have been around in a long time." She held his gaze without flinching. "That is plain," she said. "I am not a man of great poetic gifts," he said. "I have noticed," she said, and the faint, dry edge of humor was there, but something else was too, something that was not humorous at all and was looking directly at him from the gray of her eyes. "Beatrice," he said. "There is land next to my father's," she said. "That I mentioned." "Yes," he said. "It is good land," she said. "Good water, the kind of place that could be made into something real." "I imagine it could," he said. "2 people could make something of it faster than one," she said. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere out in the dark the cattle were moving in their sleep, a low, steady sound. The Kansas sky above was wide and black and shot through with stars. "Is that an offer?" he said. "It is whatever you want it to be," she said. And then, because she was Beatrice Keller and she did not trade in half measures, "Yes, it is an offer." He was quiet for a long moment, but it was not the quiet of hesitation. It was the quiet of a man letting something real fully land in him. "My hands shook after the stampede," he said. "Did I mention that?" "You did," she said. "They did not shake tonight," he said. "Saying that to you, asking you if that offer is what I think it is." "What do you think it is?" she said. "I think it is an invitation to build something together," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then I accept," he said. Without reservation. She held out her hand across the fire, and he took it, and neither of them let go for a long moment while the stars wheeled overhead, and the cattle breathed in the dark, and Santos, who had been at the wagon all along and had seen and heard none of it or perhaps all of it, whistled something soft to himself. The last 2 weeks of the drive had a different quality to them now, with this new thing acknowledged between them, this new thing being added to everything else that the days contained. They were still workers on a cattle drive with a job to complete. The cattle still needed to be moved, the flanks still needed to be covered, the watches still needed to be maintained. But within all of that practical reality, there was now this other current running alongside it, warm and steady. They rode together more often when the work allowed it. He deferred to her reading of the trail ahead when they were in country she knew better than him, which she found she appreciated not because she needed the validation, but because it was simply the correct thing to do, and he did it without self-consciousness. She deferred to his organization of the crew when those decisions were his to make, for the same reason. They fit together like two pieces of a system designed to work in parallel. One evening about a week from Abilene, a thunderstorm building to the west, they were riding the western perimeter of the herd checking the boundary when Jeremiah pulled his horse up on the crest of a low rise and sat looking at the sky for a moment. "Kansas is beautiful when it is not trying to drown you," he said. "It makes up for it after," she said, pulling up beside him. They sat there together on the rise with the wind moving through the grass around them and the clouds building their great towers in the west and the herd spread below them like a slowly moving brown sea. And Beatrice thought that she had been in this country her whole life and had never seen it quite like this, not different exactly, but framed differently. Seen through an additional dimension. He was looking at her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking about the land next to my father's," she said. "What about it?" "I am thinking about what it could be," she said. "In 5 years, 10, with water properly managed and the right breeding stock." "Tell me," he said, so she did. She had been building it in her mind for 2 years, this plan, and she laid it out with the precision and detail of someone who has been working through a problem from every angle: the water rights and the well situation, the layout of the range, the type of cattle that would do best in that specific country, the market considerations, the way her father's existing operation could be integrated and expanded. It was not a dream exactly. It was a design. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment. "That is a serious plan," he said. "I am a serious person," she said. "I know," he said. "It is one of the things I have noticed about you." He paused. "Have money saved," he said. "Not a great deal, but enough to be meaningful. 3 years of trail wages set aside." She looked at him. "I am not asking for your money," she said. "I know," he said. "I am offering it because if I am going to be part of this thing you are building, I should come with something useful." "You bring plenty that is useful," she said. "Nevertheless," he said. She held his gaze. "We should discuss it properly," she said, "when we have the time to do it right." "In Abilene," he said. "In Abilene," she agreed. He reached across the space between their horses and touched her hand briefly, just his fingers over hers on the saddle horn, and she turned her hand and held his for a moment, and they stayed like that for a few seconds while the Kansas wind moved around them and the storm built in the west and the herd moved below. Then the first distant crack of thunder came rolling across the plain and they both looked up. "Here we go again," she said. "Better get back," he said. And they turned their horses and rode back down the rise into the gathering weather, and the night was long and the rain was cold, but the herd held. And by morning the sun was out and the Kansas plains were steaming and golden, and the distance to Abilene was measurable in single-digit days. They had one final test 3 days from the city. A group of men, 4 of them, riding hard-used horses and carrying rifles across their saddles in the casual way of people who want those rifles to be noticed, intercepted the drive on an afternoon when Jeremiah was riding point and 2 of the crew were down with a stomach ailment that had cycled through the camp. The men claimed to represent a landowner whose fence line the cattle had supposedly crossed, though there was no fence visible and no landowner's name that Jeremiah recognized from any previous drive. The demand was money, $20, which in 1878 was a significant amount, or they would turn the herd. These were the kinds of men who existed on the edges of cattle country in that era. Opportunists who had figured out that a trail boss who is 3 days from the end of a 6-week drive and managing a sick crew is in a poor position to argue. The calculation was correct as far as it went. Jeremiah sat his horse in front of them without any visible emotion, and he said in his level voice, "I do not know you. I do not know the land you are claiming, and I do not pay money for problems that do not exist. Ride on." The leader of the four was not accustomed to being spoken to that way, and he let it show, and his hand moved toward the rifle. Beatrice, who had come up from the flank when she saw the riders stop the drive, was positioned now to the left of the confrontation, with an angle that none of the four had apparently fully registered. Her rifle was in her hand, not raised but present, in the way a person holds a tool they know well and intend to use correctly. "Gentlemen," she said in a voice that was entirely conversational, "I count 4 of you and I have 12 rounds. I'm a better shot than I appear and a worse person to argue with than you have calculated. Mr. Bishop has given you your answer. I would recommend taking it." The 4 men looked at her. They looked at each other. The arithmetic was simple enough. They rode away south, moving fast, and did not look back. The crew, those who had seen it, were very quiet for a moment. Then Brody let out a long breath and said, "Lord above." And Chip Dawson, who had started this drive as the loudest skeptic about her presence, turned to the man nearest him and said, with something that was very close to pride, "Have you seen a steadier hand on a crew in your life?" Jeremiah rode up beside Beatrice as the drive began moving again. He did not say anything immediately, just rode beside her. "You did not need to put yourself in that position," he said at last. 4 of them and your hands were down," she said. "The math was simple." "You could have been shot," he said, and the way he said it was not about the operational concern. It was about something else entirely, the particular tight quality in a person's voice when they are thinking about what might have been taken from them. "So could you," she said. He looked at her. "Beatrice," he said. "Jeremiah," she said. "When we get to Abilene," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." They rode into Abilene, Kansas, on a Wednesday morning in late June 1878. With the sun climbing behind them and the dust rising in a golden column from 800 sets of hooves, and the stockyards coming into view ahead like a city within the city, loud and full and smelling of cattle and money, and the end of long effort. The sale of the herd took most of 2 days, with Hargrove doing the negotiating and Jeremiah present to verify the counts and Beatrice helping organize the cutting and sorting of cattle by grade, a job she did with the same precise efficiency she brought to everything. The final price was good. The Kansas market was strong that summer, and when Hargrove paid out the wages, he paused when he got to Beatrice. $30 was the agreed wage, he said. That was the agreement, she said. I am going to give you 40, he said, and if you ever need trail work again, there is a place on my crew. She took the $40 with a nod and without making a speech about it. That evening, the crew gathered in one of the saloons on the main street of Abilene that was prepared to do business with a mixed company, and there was a good deal of drinking and some attempts at dancing, and the kind of loud relieved noise that follows the successful conclusion of something very hard. Santos, who never drank spirits himself, but was always happy to be present at other people's enjoyment of them, sat in a corner and watched everything with his small, contented smile. Jeremiah sat beside Beatrice at the far end of the bar, close enough that their elbows nearly touched, and they talked under the noise of the room. I need to be honest with you about something, he said. Go ahead, she said. I have never in my life thought about one particular piece of land, he said. I have always been a man who goes where the work is. I have lived in 7 states and the territory, and I have not once looked at a place and thought, that is the place. She waited. I have thought about the land next to your father's, he said, every day for the past 2 weeks. I have thought about the water system and the breeding stock and the market access. I have thought about the specific quality of light you described when you talked about the way the afternoons come through the hills there. She looked at him. That might be the most romantic thing you have said to me, she said. A slow smile moved across his face, rare and genuine and transforming. I am working on it, he said. Jeremiah, she said, I want to be very clear about something. Please, he said. I am not looking for someone to run my father's land for me, she said. I am looking for someone to build something alongside me, as a partner, an equal partner. I know, he said. That is why I am here and not already halfway back to Texas. She studied him. You are a straightforward man, she said. I try to be, he said. I find I like it extremely, she said. I find I have liked it from the beginning. He turned on the bar stool to face her more fully, and the noise of the saloon receded to a kind of background blur, and he said, Beatrice Keller, I am asking you to consider seriously and without any pressure whether we are talking about a business partnership or about something else, because in my case it is something else and I want to be honest about that. In my case, she said, it is also something else. He looked at her for a long moment. Then something else it is, he said. She reached up and touched the side of his face, briefly, her fingers against the weathered roughness of his jaw, and he caught her hand there for just a moment. Something else, she said. The room was loud and warm, and the night was full. They stayed in Abilene for 3 days, which was the time it took to arrange the return journey, and for Jeremiah to send a telegraph message south to a horse dealer he knew about a matter of business. He also spent one morning at the land registry office, looking at available claims in the county Beatrice had described, and came back to the boarding house where they were both staying with a folded paper that he set in front of her at the table where she was writing a letter to her father. She unfolded it. It was information about the parcel next to her father's land, the legal description, the current status, the asking price. The asking price has dropped, she said, since I last had information. It has been available for 8 months, he said. They want to sell. She looked at the numbers. Between my wages from this drive and what I had saved, she said, working it out, and if we combined with what you mentioned, we could make an offer today, he said. She looked up at him. By telegraph, she said. The land registry office has the wire, he said. She considered for a moment, and then she picked up the pen she had been writing her letter with, and she made 2 calculations in the margin of the page and then looked at him. $50 less than asking, she said, and we ask for 60 days to close. Agreed, he said without hesitation. They may not take it, she said. Then we offer 40 less than that, he said. She smiled. They will take 50, she said, with the calm certainty of someone who has thought about this piece of land from every angle for 2 years. The owner moved to Missouri last fall. He wants it resolved. She was right. The answer came back by wire the following morning, accepted with a 30-day closing at the buyer's convenience. Jeremiah read the telegram and handed it across the breakfast table to her, and she read it and set it down, and there was a moment of shared stillness that was very full of the weight of something real happening. We should go to your father, he said. Yes, she said, we should. I would like to meet him, he said, properly, and speak to him. She looked at him. Speak to him about what, she said. About his daughter, he said, about my intentions, which are serious. She was very still. Jeremiah Bishop, she said. Yes, he said. Are you? I am, he said. Not today because we need to get home first, but yes. I am telling you what is coming so it is not a surprise, because you are not a woman who would want to be surprised, and because I mean it completely. She looked at him across the breakfast table of a boarding house in Abilene, Kansas, with the sound of the street coming through the window and the telegram about the land between them on the table. I appreciate the warning, she said. Her voice was slightly different, slightly lower, slightly less brisk. I thought you might, he said. The return journey south was made by stagecoach and horse, a mixed and occasionally uncomfortable combination of transportation modes. They traveled with two other members of the crew who were heading back to San Antonio, Brody and Santos, the latter of whom had a daughter in the city and went home every summer after the drive. Santos sat across from Beatrice in the stagecoach on the second day and, in the manner of a man who has nothing to prove and no reason for subterfuge, said to her in his direct way, "He is a good man, the best I have ridden with." "I know," she said. "He has not looked at a woman this way before," Santos said. "I have ridden 4 drives with him, I would know." "Santos," she said. "Yes." "I know," she said again gently. He nodded and looked out the window and said nothing more about it, but he was smiling quietly at the passing country. They reached San Antonio in 8 days, and Santos went to his daughter, and Brody went to his boarding house, and Jeremiah, and Beatrice continued south and west to the Keller property, which was a 2-hour ride from the city on a dirt road that wound through live oak country and opened eventually onto a modest but well-kept ranch. Emmett Keller was on the porch when they rode in, his damaged leg stretched out carefully before him on a low stool, and he watched them come up the road with the focused attention of a man who has been waiting and who is reading what he sees with considerable experience. Beatrice swung down and went up the porch steps and embraced her father, and he held her with the intensity of a man who has spent 2 months trying not to worry. "You are in one piece," he said. "All of me," she said. She stepped back and looked at him, checking his color, the leg, the general measure of how the 2 months without her had treated him. "I am fine," he said, with the mild indignation of a man who does not require monitoring. Then he looked past her. "This is Bishop." Jeremiah had dismounted and was standing at the foot of the porch steps. "Yes, sir," he said. "Jeremiah Bishop, I am glad to meet you." Emmett Keller studied him for a long moment with gray eyes that were very similar to his daughter's. "Come up here," he said, "and tell me about my daughter on the trail." Jeremiah came up the steps and sat in the offered chair, and he told Emmett Keller about the drive with the same honest directness he brought to everything. He did not minimize the difficulty or sensationalize it. He told him what happened at the Red River crossing. He told him about the stampede, and the night Beatrice had turned the front of the herd with him in the dark and the rain. He told him about the incident with the 4 men outside Abilene. He told him about every hard piece of it and about the ways his daughter had handled each one. Emmett listened without expression until Jeremiah described the 4 men and Beatrice's positioning and the 12 rounds. Then the older man looked at his daughter. "That sounds like you," he said. "It was the most sensible option," she said. "It sounds like your mother," he said. It was said simply, without sentimentality and yet full of it. Then he looked at Jeremiah again. "You want to speak to me about something," he said. "Yes, sir," Jeremiah said. "2 things. The first is the land." He laid out the telegraph and the information about the purchase, and Emmett read it carefully with the focus of a man who understands land and what it means. When he looked up, there was something in his face that was about more than the practical content. "She has been wanting that piece for 2 years," he said. "I know," Jeremiah said. "She described it on the trail well enough that I wanted it too." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "The second thing," he said. "Your daughter," Jeremiah said. Emmett Keller looked at him for a long, careful moment. "My daughter," he said, "does not need my permission for anything. She has not needed it since she was approximately 16 years old, and I respect that, but I appreciate you speaking to me." "I am not asking permission," Jeremiah said. "I am asking your opinion of me." Something shifted in Emmett's face at that, a small movement that was close to respect. "My opinion," the old man said. "My opinion is that you have been riding beside her for 2 months and have not once, from what I can see in the way she came home, made her feel like she had to prove herself. That is not a small thing." "No," Jeremiah said. "It is not." "My opinion," Emmett said, "is that she came home with more ease in her than when she left, which tells me something about what your company has been to her." He looked at his daughter. "Beatrice," he said, "do you want this man?" "Yes," she said, without a second's hesitation. Emmett nodded. "Then that is the end of my opinion on the subject," he said. "The rest is between the 2 of you." They stayed at the Keller ranch that night. and Jeremiah slept in the small bunkroom that Emmett used for ranch hands. And in the morning the three of them sat at the table for breakfast and talked about the land purchase and the plan for the operation with the serious working intensity of people who are building something real. Emmett had thoughts about water. There was a spring on the eastern edge of the new parcel that he had been watching for years, and he knew its output in wet years and dry years and what it could support. Jeremiah had thoughts about fencing, not the barbed wire that was beginning to arrive in the region and that he considered too dangerous for livestock, but the wooden post handrail that was more labor-intensive and more expensive and longer-lasting. Beatrice had thoughts about everything, laid out in the organized way she had been laying it out in her head for 2 years, and the conversation that morning was one of the better ones any of them had ever been in. The closing on the land happened 30 days later, on a warm morning in August, in the county clerk's office in the nearby town of Castroville. Both of their names went on the document, Beatrice Keller and Jeremiah Bishop, alongside the description of 160 acres of Texas Hill country with a spring on the eastern edge and a live oak grove in the southwest corner and good grass all through it. When they came out of the clerk's office into the August morning, Jeremiah stopped on the steps and turned to her. "I have a question," he said. "Ask it," she said. "I have been thinking about it since Abilene," he said, "and I had intended a more elaborate approach, but I find I am not capable of it." She looked at him. "Beatrice," he said, "will you marry me, not because of the land which we can hold together regardless? Not because of your father or the operation, because I cannot imagine a morning that you are not in." She was very still. "That is elaborate enough," she said. "Is it?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Is that?" "Yes," she said. "That is a yes, Jeremiah, yes." He reached out and took her face in both his hands, carefully, the way he did everything, and kissed her there on the steps of the county clerk's office in Castroville, Texas, in August of 1878, and it was the most uncomplicated and certain thing either of them had done in a long time. They were married 6 weeks later, in the early autumn, in the yard of the Keller ranch with the live oaks beginning to turn, and the sky that particular blue that Texas only produces in October when the summer has finally relented. Emmett Keller stood beside his daughter and gave the blessing, because there was no one else she would have wanted there, and Santos came from San Antonio for the occasion with his daughter and her family, and Brody and Chip Dawson came because they were, by that point, friends in the way that people become friends when they have pushed 800 Longhorns to Kansas together. Even Harold Hargrove attended, sitting in the back in his good hat and looking satisfied in the way of a man who likes to see things go well. The ceremony was performed by the local minister and was simple and direct, matching the two people at the center of it. When it was done and the documents were signed and the thing was real, Jeremiah looked at Beatrice and said, quietly only for her, "I should have told you on the first day." "What would you have told me?" she said. "That I had never seen anyone ride in the way you did," he said, "and that I already knew it was going to matter." "You were right to wait," she said. "We had to earn it." "We did," he said. Santos made the wedding supper, which was extraordinary, and the October evening was warm and full of talk and laughter, and the particular satisfaction of a celebration that has been earned by the people celebrating it. The first winter on the new land was hard in the way that first winters always are on new land. There were fences to build, and a new well to deepen, and the question of the spring output to be resolved before they could commit to the size of the herd they would run. They worked through it together, Beatrice and Jeremiah, alongside Emmett, who contributed what he could and managed the books and the correspondence with buyers and dealers that was his particular skill. Jeremiah proved to be, as Beatrice had assessed him on the trail, exactly what he appeared to be. He did not change when the circumstances changed. He was the same man in the cold of winter fence building as he had been in the long days of the trail drive, steady, capable, thoughtful, and present. He deferred where deference was appropriate and led where leadership was needed, and the line between those situations was always clear to him, which Beatrice found was one of the most valuable qualities a person could have. He also made her laugh. Not constantly. He was not a man of constant performance, but with the specific dry observation of someone who notices the small absurdities of life and can articulate them with precision. He could make her laugh with a single sentence said without expression, and she found this disproportionately delightful. She, for her part, remained as direct as she had always been, and as capable, and as unwilling to shrink into a shape that the world might find more comfortable. She ran the ranch operation with a clarity that impressed the local ranchers who had initially been skeptical of her involvement. And after the first season, those skeptics were generally quiet because the proof was in the herd health and the market numbers. By the following spring, the operation was beginning to function the way she had designed it to. The spring on the eastern edge was producing reliably, and they had built a simple but effective system to run water where it was needed. The fencing was done. The first good herd was on the grass. Emmett Keller watched all of it from his porch with the contained satisfaction of a man who has spent his life building a thing and has managed to see it continue past him. In the spring of 1879, Beatrice found that she was expecting their first child. She told Jeremiah on a morning when they were walking the eastern fence line, checking for winter damage, and she said it in the same direct way she said everything, watching his face. What crossed his face was not surprise so much as something large and quiet and warm, the way a light changes when a cloud moves and the full sun comes through. "When?" was the first thing he said. "October," she said, "near as I can figure." He stopped walking. He turned to her. "Are you well?" he said. "Very well," she said. "I am sturdy, Jeremiah, you know this." "I know," he said. "I also know that sturdy is not the same as invulnerable." "No," she said, "it is not." He put his arms around her there on the fence line with the Texas spring coming up around them in that extravagant way it does the bluebonnets in the low spots, the redbuds in the creek bottoms, the sky enormous and blue. "October," he said quietly against her hair. "Yes," she said. He held her for a while, and the morning moved around them with the sounds of the ranch waking up, the horses in the corral, the cattle in the near pasture, Emmett's voice talking to the dog somewhere toward the house. Their son was born on the 14th of October, 1879, large and loud and unequivocal in his arrival, and they named him Emmett James Bishop after two men whose character they wanted the boy to carry. Old Emmett Keller, when he first held the baby, was very still for a long moment, and then he looked up at his daughter with an expression that was too full for any particular description. "He looks like your mother," he said. "He looks like you too," she said. "Both then," Emmett said. "Good." The baby was in fact dark-haired and gray-eyed like his mother, and had his father's broad shoulders even in miniature, and screamed with an energy that suggested he would be thoroughly opinionated about everything once he had the vocabulary for it. Jeremiah held his son in the October morning, and looked at Beatrice with that expression she had first seen at the Red River crossing, the one that had given up being controlled and was just open and real. "Emmett James Bishop," he said. "Emmett James Bishop," she confirmed. "We made something good," he said. She reached up and touched his face, the same gesture she had made in the Abilene saloon, and he turned his face into her hand. "We did," she said. "We continue to." The years that followed were full years, full of work and difficulty, and the small and large pleasures of a life built on honest ground. The operation grew steadily rather than dramatically, in the way of things that are built correctly. By 1882, they were running a herd of respectable size and had hired 2 permanent hands. Emmett Keller's leg continued to be unreliable, but his mind was as sharp as it had ever been, and he remained an essential part of the operation in all the ways that did not require him to be on horseback. Beatrice went on a second cattle drive in 1881, when a neighboring rancher needed experienced trail hands and Jeremiah was not available because young Emmett had a fever that had worried them. She rode again without drama, and came home 45 days later with money and trail dust, and the same look in her eyes that the open country always put there. Jeremiah met her at the road when she came home and did not say much, but he held her horse's bridle while she swung down, and then he held her, right there in the road, for a long time. "You were worried," she said. "Yes," he said. "About me or about the baby?" "Both," he said, equally and specifically. "I am home," she said. "I noticed," he said. "I'm very glad of it." In 1883, a second child arrived, a girl this time, named Clara Mee Bishop, who came into the world in the summertime with considerably more ease than her brother, and who had her father's coloring, dark gold and steady, and her mother's gray eyes, and her grandmother's name folded into her middle name. Emmett held Clara with the particular reverence of an old man holding something he knows is precious beyond calculation. "This family," he said, looking at Beatrice and Jeremiah, "is a fine thing. It started with a man who did not ask foolish questions," Beatrice said. Jeremiah looked at her. "What questions should I have asked?" he said. "None," she said. "That was exactly the right number." He smiled, and it was the rare full smile that she had learned to watch for, slow and genuine and transforming, and she smiled back at him with all of it. The years and the trail and the storms and the river and the land and the children and the morning walks and the evening fires and the long honest conversations and the work done side by side and the life built out of the particular combination of two people who had found in each other something they had not known they were looking for. Young Emmett, who was 4 and full of opinions, looked up at the gathered faces of his family and said with great seriousness, "Is that baby coming to stay?" "She is," Beatrice said. "For how long?" Emmett asked. "Forever," Jeremiah said. Emmett considered this with the gravity appropriate to the subject. "All right," he said, and went back to what he had been doing, which was attempting to teach the ranch dog to sit on command, an effort that was not going especially well. The October after Clara was born, Beatrice stood on the porch of the house they had finished building on the new land the previous year. A proper house now, stone and timber, with a porch that faced east to catch the morning, and a fireplace in the main room that was large enough to heat the whole building, and looked out at the country that was hers and Jeremiah's and her father's and her children's, and felt the particular quality of rightness that comes from a life that has been built according to something true. Jeremiah came out behind her with 2 cups of coffee and handed one over without asking, because after 5 years he knew exactly when she was standing on the porch wanting coffee. He stood beside her, and they both looked at the country. The sun was coming up over the hills to the east, gold and long-shadowed, and the cattle were moving in the near pasture with the slow morning purpose of animals that are well-fed and at ease. And somewhere inside the house, their son was telling their daughter something at high volume that probably required parental intervention, but not immediately, not quite yet. "Are you happy?" he said. It was a question he asked her sometimes, not from anxiety but from the same honest directness that had characterized him from the beginning. He was a man who wanted to know the truth of things and was not afraid to ask for it. She turned and looked at him. He was 35 now, the same steady and capable presence he had been on the trail, though the years had added something, not age exactly, but depth, the weight of a life that had been fully inhabited. "I am," she said. "Completely." "Good," he said. "Are you?" she said. He looked out at the country for a moment, and then at her, and she could see in his face the same thing she had first seen at the Red River, the openness of it, the complete and uncalculated warmth of it. "Every morning I wake up here," he said. "I think about riding up to Hargrove's ranch and a woman tying off a horse at the Remuda line, and how that was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me that I almost did not notice." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood there on the porch in the October morning, while the sun came up over the hills and the country spread before them in all its wide and particular beauty. Inside the house, young Emmett Bishop, who was 4 years old and had decided that his sister needed to know about cattle drives immediately, was telling Clara Mee Bishop, who was 3 months old and understood none of it and found it deeply interesting anyway, about how his mother had turned 800 longhorns in a river crossing in the rain. He had heard the story only twice, but he had the essential details, and he told it with conviction. "Mama turned the big cows," he said, with the authority of someone relating historical fact. "And Papa was there too, and they did it together." Clara blinked at him. "Together," Emmett repeated, satisfied, and the morning continued around them, full and bright and going on. Beatrice Keller Bishop and Jeremiah Bishop ran their ranch through the 1880s and into the 1890s with the same partnership they had established on a cattle drive in the spring of 1878, equal in work and equal in standing and equal in the private, full, unhurried love that had grown from two people working side by side in a wide country and having the good sense to pay attention to what they found there. Emmett Keller lived to see his grandchildren running across the land he had worked, and died peacefully in the spring of 1887 in the bedroom of the stone house, with Beatrice beside him and the sound of the ranch going on outside the window. He had been a good man, and was missed in the way that good men are missed specifically, with the texture of particular days remembered. Santos came to the funeral and embraced Beatrice with the warmth of an old friend, and he sat on the porch with Jeremiah that evening, and they talked about old trail days with the ease of men who have shared something significant. The Kishom Trail itself faded in the late 1880s as the railroads reached deeper into Texas, and the long drives became less necessary. The era of the great cattle drives was a short one in the history of the country, roughly 2 decades between the end of the Civil War and the closing of the open range, and Beatrice Keller had ridden it at its height, in the last bright years of its fullness, and had carried back from it more than wages. She had carried back the land and the man and the life. Young Emmett Bishop grew up to be serious and capable in ways that reminded nearly everyone who knew him of both his parents, which was the highest compliment available. Clara Mee Bishop grew up to have her father's patience and her mother's directness, which was a combination that served her extremely well. On an evening in the early autumn of 1892, Beatrice and Jeremiah sat on the porch of their house as they had sat on that porch through many evenings across the years, with the same coffee and the same country before them and the same ease between them that had been building since a campfire on the Kishom Trail. 14 years, she said. Since the drive, he said. Since you rode up beside me at a creek crossing and told me I had kept the near corner tight, she said. That was a compliment, he said. I know, she said. I recognized it as such. You did not say anything, he said. I was busy with the brindle steer, she said. He laughed the full, unguarded laugh that she had not heard on that first day and that she had spent 14 years thinking was one of the finest sounds she knew. The evening settled around them, warm and golden and complete. The children were inside, or in the barn, or somewhere on the property that was theirs and would be theirs long after. The cattle were in the pasture. The spring on the eastern edge was running clean. The live oaks in the southwest corner were holding their summer green against the beginning of autumn. Jeremiah reached over and took her hand, the way he had reached across the space between their horses on the crest of a Kansas rise, and she held his, the way she had held it then, and they sat together in the evening while the country they had built their life on stretched away from them in every direction, real and wide in theirs. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything, assembled piece by patient piece from the raw material of two people who had found each other in the wide-open country, and had had the wisdom and the will to hold on.